Hey everyone, this is Kevin from thechesswebsite.com, and today we're starting our coverage of the 2018 World Chess Championships. I'm going to go over some details about the tournament, and then we will get into game number one. For those not familiar with the championship, plays every 2 years. Magnus Carlsen, the champion, has won the last three. He'll be one of the competitors, and his opponent, who won the Candidates tournament earlier this year, is Fabiano Caruana. Now, Magnus Carlsen, 27 years old, from Norway. We talked about, won the last three championships. He is the defending champion, also ranked number one in the world. Just so happens Fabiano, his opponent, 26 years old, is currently ranked at number two in the world. But he is here not because of that rank, but because he did win that Candidates tournament earlier in the year. He's looking to become the first American to win the World Championship since 1972. Now, this tournament is going to take place from November 9th to November 26th. If there is a tie at the end of that, there will be a day off and then tiebreakers on November 28th. This is played in London. It's 12 matches. It's the first player to 6.5 points. So you get a full point for a win. You get half a point for a draw. So 6.5 points will be victorious. If they are tied 6-6, that's when we will have those tiebreakers. So those are some logistics around the match itself. As far as time controls, every tournament's going to be different, but for the World Championship, the first 40 moves, they have 100 minutes. They get 30 seconds after every move that they make. After they've moved 40 times, they get an additional 50 minutes. And then after the next 20 moves, they will get 15 minutes added on. No additional bonus time will be added, but they still do get that 30 seconds added after every single move. Also, one thing to note is there can be no draws before Black's 30th move, which is always nice. There have been tournaments in the past where you'd see some draws after move 17 or 20. Very disappointing for all the fans who wait so long to see the World Championship. So there will be no draws before you see Black playing his 30th move. So we'll go ahead and get into it with game number one. Magnus Carlsen did win the die roll. He decided to play second. So he's going to be playing the black pieces. Fabiano Caruana will play the white pieces in game number one. Fabiano starts out with pawn to e4, met by pawn c5, the Sicilian defense, knight f3, knight c6, bishop to b5. So Fabiano right out the bat, not looking to go down the main line of pawn d4. Instead plays bishop b5 and then pawn to g6. So white looking to give up the bishop pair early on in exchange for the double pawns on the c file. Black on the other side, looking to fianchetto his bishop here to g7. Then he can castle on the king side if he wants to. He can later push forward with his two central pawns, but this is how it usually goes for both sides. So bishop to c6. There is an exchange right here. Black has the option to take with either pawn. Taking with his d-pawn does open up the door for his light square bishop to get involved early, for the queen to attack, and if Black ever wanted to castle on the queen side with a little bit more safety than if he took with his pawn from b7. Pawn d3, solidifying the pawn chain, also opening up the door for the dark square bishop to get involved into the game. Bishop to g7, pawn h3, just stopping the bishop to coming down here to g4. Since the light square bishop is open here, where does it really go? Doesn't want to come to e6. That blocks off the pawn from pushing forward. We can already see that it can't come down here to f5. So that's what Fabiano's looking to do. Just stop the bishop coming down here, getting involved into the game. So knight to f6, then up here to c3, and then knight to d7. So Magnus Carlsen already looking to play not the main line of what we would expect. From here, you might see queen to c7. You could even see queen to b6. Logical just to castle on the king side as well. But wants to maneuver his knight around, plays knight to d7. We see bishop here to e3. Pawn e5, center of the board. Castle on the king side, and then pawn to b6. And this is really where, you know, all the theory starts to change. There's not really any game, if you look in the past for high level, that really plays this b6 move. So Fabiano took a lot of time on this move and played knight to h2, and this took him 18 minutes. Again, they start out with 100 minutes on their clock for the first 40 moves, and most of the time, especially for white, they have a lot of preparation. They know what their opponent's going to be doing, and all the variations, they have a plan. It doesn't take them very often to move. Many times you're looking at 1 minute for the moves, if not sooner. So to take 18 minutes for move number 10 was surprising to see. Knight here to f8. Not sure if that confused Fabiano even more, but the next move took 12 minutes, and that is pawn to f4. I do think this is the right tactic. Anytime your opponent's going to move their knight back to the 8th row, it is time to attack, especially if you're a white. You have to really use that as an opportunity to attack your opponent. I wish the knight back here wasn't on h2, wish it was a little bit more forward, but we do see an attack starting from Fabiano on the king side of the board. Pawn takes on f4, rook takes here, bishop to e6. Almost just assumed that Magnus would play knight to e6. Just moving this knight around the board, it felt like this was the right time. Get involved into the center of the board, attack this rook, force the rook to come back. But instead, Magnus Carlsen, he had a different plan. Bishop to e6. The rook still comes back here to f2, but then pawn to h6. This is another one of those moves that just did not expect to see here. Maybe now the knight could come over here to d7. From here, maybe knight to f3. We could castle on the king side. Very safe structure for black. I think this is completely fine. But as soon as we see pawn to h6, this signifies that black's probably not looking to castle on the king side, especially with this f-file, semi-open file for white here can really start to attack. Black does not want to have any sort of weakness in front of his king. So instead, Magnus Carlsen sees an opportunity to push here on h6. And then later on, if he wants to, he can castle on the queen side. White plays queen to d2, just completing development. Pawn to g5. So if you play a move, you got to commit to that strategy. That's what Magnus Carlsen does. He starts to attack on the king side of the board. Rook over here to f1, just starting the attack. Wants to make sure that he's controlling this f file right here. Queen down here to d6. Knight to g4, castle on the queen side as we talked about, and then knight to f6. If you really look at where white's going to go here, there's not a lot of great options. One thing he could try is pawn to a3. Wants to get his other knight involved into the game, but right now it is tied down to protecting this pawn. So could try something like pawn to a3, then get his knight involved into the game if he wants to. That is one option. Would take a few moves to move that around. Instead, decides to play knight to f6. Knight to d7 from Magnus Carlsen, offering up a trade. White decides not to go ahead and trade. Brings his knight back here to h5. Magnus Carlsen centers both of his bishops now. Always good to get those involved into the center. Controls more area of the board. Pawn to g4. So things get pretty risky, in my opinion, for Fabiano, pushing so much material in front of his king. Doesn't have a lot of king safety. Really going to be using his pieces instead of his pawns to protect. So just something to be aware of as Magnus Carlsen is going to be looking to attack his opponent. He can't try anything too crazy here. You know, it would be nice if he could just come up and take with his rook right here. Bishop takes, and then rook comes up here. But the problem is when queen comes over here to g6. Attacking both the knight and the rook. Rook comes back. We already know what happens. This knight is going to fall right here on g5. If it doesn't, if we start to see something instead, okay, it's just going to be bad. There's no way for a white to hold on to material already down in material. So that's all going to be bad. Does not have that option. So instead, decides to play, after the knight here to d7, just comes back to h5. Bishop e5, and then pawn to g4. Now we see pawn to f6. So wants to make sure that, yes, now that white has given up the opportunity, we're not going to see the rook coming back here to the 7th rake any longer. Pawn to b3, bishop up here to f7, attacking the knight. White says, okay, yeah, that's fine. Not going to worry about that right now. As Magnus Carlsen does have the option, if you want to go ahead and take this material right here. Pawn could recapture. You could see rook to g8. just really start pushing here. We have the pawn, double pawns here on the H file. But besides that, no pawns in front of the king. Thought we might see Magnus Carlsen try that, but instead decides to go for more of a normal, let's build up approach. Don't want to do anything too crazy until he feels really confident about the attack. So plays knight to f8. Knight takes here on f6. We see knight coming down here to e6. And this is interesting, and what I always admire about Magnus Carlsen, he gives up a pawn in material. If you look at this, the knight here on d7 is protecting this pawn here on f6. He looks at this and says, okay, yeah, I'm going to go ahead and move my knight here to f8. I'm going to give up that pawn because I really like my knight here on e6. I see a strong attack later on. I feel like I can get that material or just have a better position. I'm willing to give up a pawn just for this move right here. Not something that many people would do, I think. So after Magnus Carlsen does that, knight comes back here to h5 where Fabiano was before. Now he's just up in material. Magnus Carlsen now decides is the time to go ahead and exchange the material. So bishop takes. Now the pawn takes. This sort of gets material back. Anytime your opponent has double pawns on a file, especially on one of these outer files, A or H, it's just so hard to protect these. So maybe Magnus Carlsen is looking at this thinking that this is worth it, as it does allow him to control more of the center. Also opens up if he wants to attack his opponent's king on the king side. Knight down here to f4. This is a great little outpost, both from the pawn as well as the bishop. Bishop takes here. Pawn recaptures, just not as good to take back with the bishop here. Knight to e3 just stops a lot of the threats that Magnus Carlsen has. So he correctly decides to take with his pawn here on f4. Fabiano plays rook to g2. Just already knowing that the rook is going to be coming to g8, and it does. We do see the queen come to e2. Want to start getting the material off of the dark square. So as you start to approach the middle game, especially the end game, you want to see if your opponent has one, maybe two bishops. Doesn't really do too much if he has two bishops, but if it's just one, you can start to maneuver your pieces on squares that are on the opposite color of your opponent's bishop, and it starts to negate the threat that they can pose on you. So you can see right now all of the pieces as well as the pawns, they are all on light squares. This dark square bishop's not going to be doing as much. So just be thinking about that in your own game. Fabiano now sees Magnus come down, take his rook here on g2. He does recapture with his own queen. Queen e6, knight to f2. White's just playing defense right now. Magnus is completely taking control of attacking his opponent. Definitely has the edge in the game. Then up here to g4 to stop the attack. Queen to e8, now threatening this pawn on h5. As we talked about, very hard to control both of the pawns, especially when they're on this outer rim. So we see Magnus start to attack that. Queen to f3. Magnus Carlsen is able to get that material back. So definitely has the advantage here. Now after king to f2, things get pretty tricky. Fabiano only has 2 minutes left on his clock. He still has 8 moves that he has to get through until he gets an additional 50 minutes on the clock. But he's going to be scrambling, and Magnus Carlsen has a ton of time on his clock, and he's going to be looking to attack his opponent. Magnus brings his bishop back here to c7. King e2, queen to g5, knight back here to h2. I just never really like the knight coming back here. It's not doing too much back on h2. Just playing defense, but not very active in the game. Pawn h5, rook here to f2. And then queen down to g1. Really like this move. Getting the queen very involved. Allows himself to get the rook involved if he wants to as well. This bishop is still defending this pawn on f4. Just such a dangerous position for Magnus Carlsen. Knight down to f1. Pawn h4. King over here to d2. King to b7. Wants to get it off this light square diagonal. Also now it's just completely protected. Doesn't have to worry about anything coming back to the 8th rank. So great position from Magnus Carlsen. We see c3, bishop to e5, just getting a better position, protecting this pawn, also attacking this pawn here on c3. The king is really forced to now defend that pawn. King to c2, and then queen to g7. This is where I think Magnus Carlsen made a huge blunder. He had a very good position right here. And then all of a sudden he comes back to g7. Yes, this is doubling up to attack this pawn, but this bishop is also defending the pawn on f4. If he takes the pawn, he's just going to give up material right back, and he's no longer in his opponent's territory. Now, Fabiano, he only has a few seconds left on his clock by this time, and then he makes his last 40th move of knight to h2, so he does have extra time added on. And then from here, Magnus Carlsen plays bishop to c3. Now, afterwards, they analyze a lot of positions on the board. They said, really, this was a huge mistake for Magnus Carlsen. He should have played queen down to g1. I would argue that the real mistake was ever bringing the queen up here to g7. You could have just kept it down here on g1 in the first place. But after Magnus Carlsen played c3, he seemed pretty upset himself, shook his head during the match. So at the end of the day, you could tell that he was not happy with the way that he approached this position. Also knowing that his opponent was under time control. It almost felt like Magnus Carlsen was trying to speed up his own moves so that Fabiano didn't have any of his time thinking and trying to rush him as well. Magnus, I think, probably should have taken some more time and just said, hey, Fabiano, I'm not going to worry about his time control. I'm going to figure out the best move. Probably would not have played queen back to g7. But in the game, played bishop to c3, and then queen takes here on f4. Magnus brings his bishop back here to d4. It's a great outpost, also attacking the rook here on f2. Fabiano took some time. There's a few reasons for that. One is he just got a lot of time on his clock, so he can actually look at the position, figure out how he is going to continue, because he's been speed racing for the last few moves, couldn't really figure out how he's going to finish the game. But also, this is the last chance that he has in the game to see if he wants to go for something, maybe more than a draw, or if he wants to go ahead and draw. So his options, so everyone is aware of what he's looking at, is one, rook to e2. This says, yeah, I'm going to continue and try for a win. I can push the pawn up. Now I can get the knight involved into the game. I'm going to try for something here. The other one is to say, I'm going to try for a draw, and that would be queen to f7, trying to get material off the board, trying to minimize what Magnus Carlsen can do with the powerful pieces. This is check, forcing the queen to come off. Now after the rook comes here, it's just much harder for Magnus to win from here. Still possible, but definitely something that Fabiano feels like, if I play this, maybe I can get an easier draw. So in the game, that's exactly what we saw. We see queen to f7, Fabiano opting to go for the draw here. So king to a6, we do see the queen take on g7, and then the rook take on g7. Don't want to capture with the bishop because this blocks off the rook from getting involved. Why is that important? Now the rook can come up here to f5. Very active rook from white. See how this is different, where if the rook takes, the rook can no longer come up here to f5 because now the rook comes down to g2 check, attacking the knight as well. So this is a terrible position for white. Wants to have an active rook but cannot do that because of after the rook taking here, he's forced to move his rook over here to e2. Really only option here is to start pushing with his pawn. But then we're going to see the rook come down here to g3, gobble up material, and no side has the advantage as far as pushing it. We will see that come to fruition. Knight up here to g4. Rook takes on h3. Pawn e5. Rook to f3. Wants to make sure the rook can swing over here to stop this pawn. Cannot promote, or that would be a victory for Fabiano. Rook to f8. Pawn e7. Rook e8. Knight up here to h6. Pawn down h3. Knight f5, defending this pawn on e7. Bishop to f6. Pawn a3. Pawn b5. So both sides just moving on the queen side, but really there's going to be an exchange coming up. So after the bishop takes on e7, we do see the knight take, and then pawn over here to h2. Fabiano's forced to take here, cannot allow his opponent to promote to a queen. So after the rook takes, now the rook takes here on e7. And then we get into the endgame. Now in this position, they have played 55 moves. 99% of players in this position are going to just agree to a draw. It's the first game. It's almost always a draw in the first game, what we see at these high-level tournaments. It's just what happens. But Magnus Carlsen is that 1% that just continues to play on. He has an advantage in material, one pawn, and he wants to play until the very, very end to see if he can find a small mistake that his opponent makes and turn that into a victory. Also, if you remember from the first time that he played Vishy Anand, one of the things that he said he was trying to do is wear out his opponent, not necessarily in one game, but he knew it was a marathon. And he knew that every match, if he could wear out his opponent, that would be better for him because he felt like in the long run, he was the better player. He just didn't tire like other players. So I did go through all those moves fairly fast. Why? Because they played for hours, and that was another 60 moves of the players going back and forth. Magnus Carlsen at the end of it said, yeah, I would have just kept going on and on, but after 115 moves, I thought I would give a draw. On the other side, Fabiano said it was torture to try to defend Magnus Carlsen with a small advantage, making sure that I did not make any mistakes. So even though they drew, Magnus Carlsen with the black pieces getting a draw feels much better, especially when his opponent says that was completely exhausting. Almost feels like a win from Magnus Carlsen. But we do have a draw in the books. Knowing that Fabiano was down, he did say that he felt so good to get a draw because he felt like he could have easily lost that game. Magnus did have the advantage, did make a blunder. Magnus Carlsen said he should not have taken him with his bishop here on c3. That was a huge mistake. So at the end of the day, great game by both players. Tried to go for the win. Didn't see any boring chess by any means. So I'll be excited to see Magnus Carlsen play the white pieces tomorrow. We're really going to be looking at playing 2 days, alternating white and black, and then taking a rest day. So in 2 days, we will have our first rest day. But hopefully you guys enjoyed game number 1. Hopefully you're excited about this tournament. Going to be a fun match to follow. But thanks for watching this video in particular, and I'll see you guys tomorrow for game number 2.